In this video lecture, we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the impact of the socioeconomic system in Texas on Texas politics. We're going to look at population, the distribution of that population in terms of race and ethnicity, and then the economy of the state of Texas as it affects how this politics of Texas takes place. One of the key points that we're going to pay attention to is, first off, that the Texas population has increased significantly. Migration and natural increase are about equal in factors. Texas is now the second most populated state in the Union, right behind California. The Texas population has become predominantly urban, and the population is not evenly distributed throughout the state because most of the growth has been largely in the urban corridors, whereas the rural areas and West Texas have tended to lose population for quite some time. This chart sort of summarizes it. Between 1870 and 2010, you can see how the population has grown from really just a little under 1 million to a little over 25 million at the present time. Notice that the line becomes significantly more steep as you get past about 1960. This is an excellent website. Click on the link and it will take you to a very good little thematic population distribution growth. Now, the question is, if you were trying to project the population of Texas by 2040, how would you do it? Well, the Texas State Data Center has worked up several population projections based on a number of scenarios. If there were no migration into the state of Texas, simply natural increase would probably be a little over 25 million people. If the rate of growth were the same as it had been between 1990 and 2000, we would have close to 50 million people in Texas. However, if we take some of the scenarios in between that, such as the rate of growth between 2000 and 2004, and the rate of growth between 2000 and 2007, we end up with a population estimate of somewhere around about a little under 45 million people. That's a lot of people. The next few slides just give you some information from the Texas State Data Center as built on what the U.S. Census has done. You'll notice that the net growth from migration and population increase are about the same. In 2010, Texas had just a little under, the growth had been just a little over 4 million people in the decade. California was the second with 3.3 million people. Notice that New York, which is the third largest state in the Union, isn't even on this chart. In fact, the population of New York has shrunk somewhat. Florida is the third most rapidly growing state, but it's still fourth in terms of size. If we look at the total population by county, you'll notice that the areas that have really been, or really the biggest, are the three major urban clusters: the Dallas-Fort Worth cluster, the Austin-San Antonio cluster, and the Houston-Galveston cluster. There's a small mini cluster down there in South Texas. Look at the counties that have lost population. You'll notice that they're predominantly in West Texas. The Hill Country, the Low Plains, parts of the High Plains, and most of the Mountain and Basin region other than El Paso. There are a few isolated counties in South Texas, that's primarily in the brush country, along the coastal Bend region, some up in East Texas that have also tended to lose. Overall, 96 counties have lost population over the two-year period between 2010 and 2012. Most recent data that I can find. The areas that have lost open space, however, tend to be near the urban clusters. Now, where did the people come from? Relatively few Native Americans. There are a few still around. Their legacy was substantial. The Caddo Indians up in northeast Texas. but at the present time there are only 3 tribes on reservations in Texas: the Alabama Coshawty Indians, the Kickapoo, and the Tigwa. One of the political controversies that has hit the realm is that in many of the other states, the Indian tribes, the Native American tribes, have been able to use gambling casinos, this is particularly true in Oklahoma, to enrich their population. And there's still a political controversy about allowing open casinos in Texas. The Hispanic population of Texas dates from the period of Spanish colonization. The Mission, the Presidio, the Ranchero, and various towns and civilian settlements. But the question can be asked, why was Hispanic or Spanish colonization relatively unsuccessful? Well, the answer is simple. Texas simply did not produce the kind of economic benefits. Much of the Spanish colonization had been built on subjugation of the native population to carry out Spanish goals, and the Indian population, Native American population in Texas was much more warlike and nomadic than you found in most of South America. Mexicans, after the 1820 revolution, attempted to try to build in Texas, but had the same economic problem. Anglo-Americans began to come into Texas shortly before the Revolution. In fact, the town of Clarksville, Texas, was one of the first towns in Texas, just south of the Red River, first towns in Texas to have been developed even before Texas became independent. Much of the early settlement came from Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and North Carolina. There was a tremendous migration into the South from the South after the Civil War. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was the damage that had been inflicted on many of the southern states. Another problem was the land or the soil had been largely worn out through the use of cotton agriculture for almost 100 years, and that brought a lot of migration into Texas. Anglos have dominated the politics and government of Texas since its independence from Mexico in 1836. The African American population of Texas have inhabited Texas since before the Texas Revolution. Now, the Mexican government opposed slavery. When Texas became a republic and then a state, it legalized slavery, and that brought a significant number of African Americans, against their will, into Texas for cotton farming. There has been a tremendous outmigration from the rural areas of Texas to the urban Texas due to the changes in agriculture and agroeconomics. Asian Americans, first Asian American residents were probably Chinese immigrants working on the building of railroads. There was a significant Japanese colonization in Texas beginning about 1903, and then after the Vietnamese War, a significant influx from the 1970s on. We're beginning to see Middle East, Indian, and other parts of Asian American belt having an impact. We've already talked about the Anglo population. Now, the most significant growth in Texas has been among the racial and ethnic minorities, particularly Hispanic. The Hispanic population of Texas is currently younger, less well educated even than the African American population, and less economically well off. If we look at the racial and ethnic composition of Texas between 2000 and 2010, notice the growth. The Hispanic population grew from 32% to 38%, while at the same time the non-Hispanic white population dropped from 53 to 45. The African American or black population has remained largely the same, and there has been an increase of 2% among others. Now, if we take a look at the projected racial and ethnic balance in Texas between 2000 and 2040, Notice something significant. The Anglo population is expected to drop to perhaps less than 30% of the state, whereas the Hispanic population will be over 50%. African American population relatively stable, and other Asian American, etc., will go from about 2% to probably 10%. How come? Well, this is called a population pyramid. If you look at the slide on the left, you will notice that the greatest bulge as percentage of population among Anglo females is between 40 and 60 years of age. Now, most 40 to 60-year-old women are not likely to start having a lot of babies, whereas among Hispanics and other minorities, the bulge occurs below, in fact, 35 years and below. That alone helps explain a big percentage of the growth. Percentage of migrants to Texas by race and ethnicity. You can study this chart. I'm not going to get carried away with it, but notice that 67% of all migrants into the state of Texas were non-Caucasian. Now, aging is an interesting problem. Notice the red counties. Notice the blue counties. The Hill Country, some isolated counties in East Texas, the Low Plains, those are the counties that have the highest percentage of older people. I hate to use that term older because 65 seems like a pretty young person to me. So where are the, quote, young people? Well, they're largely in the major urban clusters and along the Black Line Prairie and in South Texas, out in the area around El Paso. Looking at the educational attainment, it becomes very obvious that the comment I made earlier about non-Hispanic whites having by far the better education than Hispanics becomes obvious. 43% of all Hispanics 25 years of age or older do not possess even a high school diploma. Now, we'll turn our attention to economic activity in Texas. There are some distinct phases of economics in Texas. Cotton and subsistence agriculture were the primary focus in Texas between 1820 and 1865. From 1865 to 1901, cattle, cotton, and grain were the mainstays of the economy. But with the discovery of oil at Spindletop, over near Beaumont, 1901, oil production became the driver of the economy. Then beginning in the 1920s, down through the 1980s, refining, petrochemical production, and related manufacturing drove the economy. Oil is still a significant part of the Texas economy, but it has changed to where the economy of Texas is more focused on electronics, biomedical, and other kinds of high tech than it was in previous years. But what were some of the factors that have helped change the economy? Well, first off, prior to the Civil War, we had almost no railroads in Texas. The rivers of Texas, as you learned in the very first unit, are not big and do not permit a lot of transportation. So unlike the Midwest, where the Ohio and Mississippi and the Illinois rivers provided very good river transit, Texas did not have that. The road system of Texas consisted mostly of dirt or mud trails, and the value of the products produced per pound just didn't justify the cost of getting them to market. As the market for cattle in the Northeast and Midwest improved, cattle drives began to push the longhorn cattle up to railheads in places like Kansas. The advent of railroads in Texas further stimulated the cattle industry, but barbed wire and windmills, which made it possible to improve the breeds of cattle, also played a major role. But then oil was discovered in 1901. Oil became plentiful. This led to the conversion of ships and trains to oil rather than coal. Now, if we had a lot of time, I could discuss that. And then, of course, automobiles came along. Beginning about the 1920s, we began to develop refineries on the Gulf Coast, like the ones in Texas City and Baytown. World War II greatly increased the demand for petroleum products and petrochemicals. Now, there was an oil embargo by the Arab nations, the OPEC nations, 1973, which drove the prices up. And there was a second oil shortage period in about the 1970s to the early 1980s, which led to soaring oil prices. Then that led to overproduction, which led to a crash in the oil prices, which led to a major impact on the Texas economy, bank failures, bankruptcies, etc. The result? It was decided to try to make the Texas economy less dependent on oil. Now, make no doubt, oil is still extremely important to the economy of Texas. If we look at gross product, California, Texas, and New York, Texas and New York are about even. Now, these are 2003 rankings, and I've been having a hard time finding current data. I'm not happy about that. Let's talk about the difference between primary and secondary economic activity. Primary economic activity earns money from other areas, whereas secondary economic activity circulates the money within the defined area. The overall economy of Texas is secondarily a secondary economy. Agriculture, mining, manufacturing, transportation, wholesale, retail trade. Notice that the biggies here are the ones that require a fair degree of education. We are still the second largest agricultural producer in the nation. California is first, Texas, then interestingly enough, Iowa. Livestock, 66%, crops, about 34%. Now, the one reason that's really important is it takes a lot fewer people to take care of an agricultural economy, which is based on livestock, than it is those on crops. Combining the mechanization of crop production, use of agriculture, use of irrigation, use of chemicals, has meant that fewer and fewer people are necessary to produce the agricultural products. And that helps explain why so many people have left the rural areas. Mining, Texas still ranks first in oil and gas production, but there's been some declining production. Now, there has been one trend, which is the use of fracking, automation of equipment, offshore drilling and offshore platforms, which have led to a significant increase in the amount of oil being produced, which drove the prices down. Well, let's talk about wealth and poverty in Texas. Poverty is more pronounced in Texas than in the nation as a whole. Texas ranks among one of the most unequal states in the distribution of income. We're 50th as the percentage of high school diplomas, 45th as the percentage of college graduates. About 26% of Hispanics live in poverty, about 21% of African Americans, but only about 8% of Anglos. Looking at median income, this is fairly old data. I've been trying to bring it up to speed. One little fascinating thing that comes up is the median income among Asian Americans per household is actually higher than that of Anglos. This is kind of a fun thing to look at in terms of economy, but what it shows is that the inequality between quartiles has grown over the period from the 1980s. Texas has a greater disparity between the bottom 5% and the top 5% than it did in the 1980s. Now, if you happen not to be overloaded on data, you can go to the Texas State Data Center or the Texas Almanac and go into a complete overdose